The year is 1487. Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital. The dedication of the Great Pyramid, the Templo Mayor. Over 4 days, up to 80,000 people were sacrificed. This is not a ritual. It is an industrial conveyor belt of death. 20,000 bodies a day, over 800 an hour, 14 hearts torn out every minute, from dawn to dusk without stopping. At the pyramid's summit, 4 teams of priests work in shifts. Their movements are perfected. An obsidian knife, a chest cut open, a heart in a bowl, a body tumbling down the steps, staining the stone red. This is not a chaotic slaughter. It is the pinnacle of state ideology, a well-oiled machine. How did a civilization that created a precise calendar and floating gardens build such a monstrous cult? What made them believe the universe would collapse without this torrent of blood? In 5 minutes, we will reveal the first part of the answer. An ideological reform that rewrote history and convinced the Aztecs they were in eternal debt to the gods. But the scale is just the first mystery. Here are 2 more that defy all logic. First, why would Aztec warriors, after capturing the strongest enemies in battle, risk ending up on the altar themselves instead of receiving the highest honors? What logic compels a nation to sacrifice its best and brightest to prove its strength to the gods? The answer to that question awaits you in Section 6. Second, this civilization created a complex solar calendar and an efficient system of aqueducts. Yet archaeologists find a ritual burial with the remains of more than 42 children sacrificed to the rain god Tlacaelel during a drought. How could a civilization of engineers and astronomers believe that the most effective way to combat a drought was the ritual murder of their own children? This was not primitive superstition, but cold, ritualistic calculation. We will uncover the secret behind this calculation in Section 4. This investigation is not just a collection of facts about an ancient civilization. It is an autopsy of a universal mechanism, a psychological model of how a society normalizes the unthinkable. We will break it down into 7 key elements. An ideological debt that can never be repaid, the logistics of death, disguised as flower wars, the psychology of the priest executioner, the symbolism of weapons and architecture that turns murder into art, the economy of fear, the psychology of the victim who walks willingly to their death, and finally, the collapse of the entire system. These aren't just facts. They are 7 interconnected gears in a single machine. By the end of this video, you will have 7 keys to understanding the psychology of state terror and propaganda. We will start in the world of gods and myths, where everything seems logical, and end in the world of cold. Politics, where it will become clear how this system led the Aztecs to their doom. Let's begin. It all begins with a debt. At the core of Aztec belief lies the myth of the creation of the 5th sun. To set the world in motion, the gods sacrificed themselves by throwing themselves into a fire. Their blood gave the sun the energy to move. From this, a simple and seemingly logical idea was born. Humans, as the children of the gods, are obligated to repay this debt. They must feed the sun with their blood, or it will stop, and the universe will perish. But this story is not an ancient tradition. It is a political project from the mid-15th century. Its author was Tlacaelel, the high counselor who effectively ruled the empire. He elevated the Aztecs' tribal god, Huitzilopochtli, to the status of the principal deity. A new god who, to survive, demanded not just sacrifices, but a constant, industrial-scale flow of human blood. To solidify this cult, Tlacaelel ordered all old books and historical records to be burned. He rewrote the past, creating a new reality where the Aztecs were the chosen people, and their mission was to save the world. But to feed such an insatiable god, a constant supply of raw material was needed. Every 52 years, this cosmic debt transformed into collective terror. On the night of the new fire ceremony, the entire empire was plunged into darkness. All hearths were extinguished. Pregnant women were locked in granaries for fear they would turn into demons. On the rooftops, people waited, gazing at the stars. Would the sun rise again? The fear was real. At this moment, where the two calendars aligned, the world was at its most vulnerable. But salvation came at a price. On a mountaintop, priests would cut open the chest of a high-ranking captive and, using a fire drill, kindle a new flame directly inside his still warm body. From this single flame, born in a human body, runners carried the fire throughout the empire. Every hearth, every candle was lit from it. Every citizen, from peasant to aristocrat, became an accomplice. Their lives and the warmth of their homes depended directly on the human sacrifice just performed. And what rituals that ensure our safety do we believe in today, without considering their true cost? The ideology of debt worked because it was total. It demanded blood not only from enemies but from the Aztecs themselves. The myth of the self-sacrificing gods was a model to be emulated. If the creators of the universe gave their lives, who were mortals to refuse? Ritual bloodletting was a mandatory practice for everyone. This wasn't just tribute. It was a constant physical reminder of the debt. But the most powerful signal came from the top. The ruler, the Tlatoani, had to publicly pierce his tongue, ears, and even genitals with maguey thorns. He would pass straw ropes through the wounds, which would become saturated with his blood in front of the crowd. This was proof. The debt applied to everyone. No one could evade it. We've understood the why. But to turn a myth into a functioning system, it required not hundreds, but thousands of victims. The ideology is in place. Now the Aztecs are not mere murderers. They are the saviors of the universe, fulfilling a sacred mission bestowed upon them by the gods. This is the ultimate goal that justifies any means. But reality demanded industrial quantities of raw material. To fuel Huitzilopochtli and demonstrate power in rituals, thousands of captives were needed annually. Conventional wars, aimed at capturing territory and resources, simply could not provide such a stable and massive flow of bodies. Therefore, the Aztecs invented something unique. They created a type of war whose sole purpose was not land, gold, or political influence, but exclusively the capture of human bodies for the altar. They put death on an assembly line, creating a veritable factory of victims. The next section will dissect the mechanism of this factory and show how entire battles were transformed into staged spectacles for a sacred hunt. These battles were called Tlacaelel, or flower wars. At first glance, they resembled a chivalric tournament on the scale of entire armies. Opponents would agree on the time and place of battle in advance, fight according to strict rules, and then disperse. But this was no duel of honor. It was a sacred hunt. Killing an enemy on the battlefield was considered a technical flaw, a spoiling of valuable material. All military tactics were subordinated to one goal: to wound, stun, and capture the enemy alive. A warrior's social status depended not on the number of kills, but on the number of captives. Capture 1, and you earn the title of Tlamani. Capture 4, and you become an elite jaguar warrior. The captive's fate was even more paradoxical. He was not met with torture and humiliation, but with ritual deification before his death. A noble warrior captured in battle was not thrown into a dungeon. He was taken to the capital, surrounded by luxury, fed the finest food, and dressed in expensive fabrics. But behind this facade of respect lay cold psychological conditioning. The captive's personality was erased. like pouring water from a jug, only to be filled with new, sacred content. He was transformed into an Ixiptlatli, a living embodiment of a god. They stopped calling him by his name. He became a function, a vessel for divine energy. The culmination of this theater could be a gladiatorial combat. The captive was given a wooden weapon and pitted against several Aztec warriors armed with real ones. His predetermined death became a grand performance. But this was the fate of the elite. From conquered peoples, the Aztecs demanded tribute in a much more prosaic form: living people. Isotopic analysis of remains found at the Templo Mayor shows that victims came from all corners of Mesoamerica. Conquered city-states paid tribute in corn, textiles, and gold, a standard imperial economy. But the Aztec codices reveal another currency: human lives. The Codex Mendoza clearly specifies quotas. Which city must supply how many people annually for the altar? This was an economy built on blood, where a human being was a standardized resource. Refusal to deliver was punished with a brutal expedition. Thus, the Aztecs created a ring of hatred around themselves. This very hatred would help a handful of conquistadors topple the empire. But what weapons did they use in this hunt? Imagine yourself as an Aztec weaponsmith. Your task: create a weapon that doesn't kill, but maims and captures. Here's the answer: the macuahuitl. A wooden club edged with sharp obsidian blades. It was ideal for inflicting lacerations, breaking bones, and causing shock from pain, but not for killing instantly like a steel sword. And yet, according to the conquistadors, its blades were so sharp they could decapitate a horse in a single blow. Their entire military technology followed the same logic. The atlatl spear thrower, entangling nets, short clubs. Aztec warriors were not soldiers in our sense of the word. They were hunters of men. But if the warrior was the hunter, who was the butcher? To cut out the hearts of dozens of people daily without going mad, the priests used brutal psychotechniques to kill the empathy within themselves. What do a priest atop a pyramid and a surgeon at an operating table have in common? Both must suppress empathy to do their job. In the elite Kalmakak schools, future priests underwent not education, but a deliberate erasure of personality. Students slept on the bare ground, ate sparingly, and worked constantly. But this was not about instilling discipline. It was a technology for killing compassion. Multi-day fasts, sleep deprivation, bathing in ice-cold water, and, most importantly, constant self-mutilation. Piercing their tongues and legs with maguey thorns turned pain into background noise. Through chronic exhaustion and pain, the priest entered an altered state of consciousness. He ceased to be a person. He became an instrument. His hands cut out the heart, but his self was absent in that moment. It's like learning to hold your breath underwater. At first, instinct screams, but through pain, you learn to suppress it until you forget how to breathe with feelings. How did the day begin for a man who was about to kill hundreds? The high priest awakens before dawn. His body is scarred, his hair matted with dry blood. He performs his ablutions in ice-cold water and another bloodletting. This is not a prayer for forgiveness. It is a calibration. A purification of the self from the remnants of humanity to become a perfect instrument of the god. He ascends to the summit of the Templo Mayor, past thousands of the doomed. But he doesn't see them as people. Years of training have done their work. He sees only vessels filled with Tlacaelel, the precious energy for the gods. They are not fathers and sons. They are a resource. His movements at the altar are precise, mechanical, almost surgical. 4 exact motions. This is not murder. For him, it is the highest form of service. And it was this state that made it possible to commit the unthinkable. We are now approaching the solution to the mystery posed at the beginning. Archaeologists found the remains of 42 children sacrificed to the rain god Tlacaelel during a drought. How could a civilization of engineers believe this would save the harvest? The answer lies in a monstrous ritualistic logic. For the Aztecs, children's tears were magically linked to rain. The more bitterly a child cried on the altar, the heavier the downpour would be. This means the priests intentionally inflicted unbearable suffering on the children before death to induce tears. They might tear out their fingernails. In their worldview, this was not sadism, but a horrific yet necessary act to save hundreds of thousands from starvation. It was a lesser evil, made possible only because the priests saw not a person in the crying child, but an instrument for climate control. Ideology demanded blood. Logistics supplied it. The priest's psychology permitted it to be shed. It seems the system is complete. But this is only the software. The conveyor belt of death must also have hardware. The architecture of the pyramids, the shape of the ritual knives, the layout of the city, none of this was mere background. They were active participants in the ritual, dictating its script. The Great Pyramid, the Templo Mayor, was not just a temple. It was a stone book that guided both victim and executioner up its steps. In the next section, we will decipher the code encrypted in stone and blade, and we will answer the question, why did the main Aztec pyramid have two temples at its summit instead of one? The answer is in the dualism encoded in stone. The two temples atop the Templo Mayor were not an architectural whim. They were a map of the Aztec universe. The southern temple, painted the red of blood, was dedicated to the war god Huitzilopochtli. The northern one, painted the blue of water, belonged to Tlaloc, the god of rain and fertility. At first glance, it seems simple. The Aztecs honored two primary gods, but the reality is deeper. This was a material symbol of the eternal balance. War and agriculture, fire and water, death and life. The victim, ascending the red or blue steps, physically restored the cosmic equilibrium with their final journey. The architecture was the script. But the temple was not the only living participant in the ritual. The instrument used to commit the murder was considered by the Aztecs not a thing, but a deity. Why was the ritual obsidian knife, the Tlacaelel, often depicted with eyes and teeth on its handle? This was not mere decoration. Obsidian, a volcanic glass, is sharper than surgical steel, the perfect material for quickly opening a chest cavity. But to a priest, it was not an object, but a being. The knife was considered the incarnation of a god named Itztli. The priest did not kill. He was merely a conduit through which the knife deity consumed the victim's heart. This knife was ritually fed with blood and dressed in garments. It was a mechanism for deflecting responsibility. The priest does not kill. Itztli performs a sacred act, like lightning finding its path from a thundercloud. Archaeologists find these knives buried with honors, like noblemen. What inanimate symbols in our culture are imbued with a power for which people are willing to kill? Why was it necessary to lead the victim in a long procession through the entire city? This was not just a demonstration of power. It was the empire's main spectacle. The procession rode past key points, turning all of Tenochtitlan into a giant stage. The main set piece, the Tzompantli, a wall built from tens of thousands of human skulls. It is estimated that the main Tzompantli contained up to 60,000 skulls. It was a graphic, physical reminder of the process's continuity. The climax was the ascent up the 114 steep steps of the Templo Mayor. For the victim, it was an ascension into the world of the gods. For the hundreds of thousands of spectators below, it was an annual demonstration of how their universe worked. But the main audience for this theater was not the gods or the capital's inhabitants. It was the ambassadors of conquered nations. stone temples symbolizing the cosmos, living knives absolving guilt, a city transformed into a stage for a ritual. Was this entire complex system created only for the gods? We've seen how architecture and tools encoded ideology in stone, making it indisputable. But what if the main purpose of this bloody theater was not the gods, but people? What if it was the most effective campaign for retaining power in history? Let's strip this ritual of its religious veil. We will see how the Aztecs created a true economy of fear. We are moving from the language of myth to the language of power. In 1487, for the dedication of the Templo Mayor, the Aztecs invited the leaders of hostile states. Why invite enemies to your most important festival? On the surface, it's a display of power and wealth. To show guests the grandeur of Tenochtitlan, the might of its army. A classic move. Impress and convince them of the futility of resistance. But the reality was different. Right before the guests' eyes, according to the chronicle of Diego Duran, a conveyor belt was launched that claimed tens of thousands of lives in 4 days. 14 victims a minute. A new heart was torn out every 4 seconds. This was not an invitation to dialogue, but a public torture session. The priests worked in shifts so the flow of blood would not cease. The message was unambiguous. This is what we do to those who resist us. Pay your tribute, or your people will become fuel for our gods. And this political calculation explains why sometimes even the best Aztec warriors ended up on the sacrificial stone. How could an Aztec warrior who captured a valiant enemy end up on the altar himself instead of receiving a reward? What is the logic in destroying your own most valuable asset? Normally, capturing a noble prisoner brought a warrior glory and promotion. Valor was rewarded. The enemy was used for the ritual. In this system, everything was logical. But in moments of crisis, the gods required something more than the blood of an enemy. They needed the blood of the strongest representative of the chosen people. The sacrifice of an elite warrior was a demonstration that the Aztecs were willing to give up their most precious asset. Such a warrior was considered not a victim, but a gift. His death was the ultimate act of political theology. It had a dual effect. It showed the gods absolute faith, and it showed people, both their own and foreigners, that the state was prepared to do anything. The ultimate tool of control. This practice of total control led directly to the most terrifying form of tribute from conquered peoples. What happened after the Aztec army conquered another city? On the surface, everything looks standard. The Codex Mendoza details what vassals were required to supply: gold, feathers, textiles, cacao, a pragmatic system of economic enrichment. But the main form of tribute was an invisible quota for the supply of people. Strontium isotope analysis of remains from the Templo Mayor confirms that 70% of the victims were from other regions. Conquered cities regularly sent their youth to Tenochtitlan. The mechanism was genius in its cruelty. The selection and dispatch of this tribute fell to the local rulers. This forced them to become accomplices, inciting the hatred of their own people. The system not only depleted the gene pool, but it also destroyed their societies from within, preventing rebellions. But we are still looking at this through the eyes of priests and politicians. What did the person on the altar see? We have analyzed the cosmic debt, the factory of victims, the training of the executioners, and the economy of fear. The system seems fully described. But this complex machine is missing one central detail. All this time, we have been looking at events from the top down, through the eyes of the emperor and the priest. We have analyzed the system as outside observers. But what did the person feel whose heart was about to be torn out with an obsidian knife? We will not understand the civilization until we look into the mind of the victim. The most chilling mystery of this story is why many went to their deaths with no visible resistance. The next step will reveal the psychology of this acceptance. Spanish chronicles are full of descriptions of this phenomenon. Valiant warriors walking to the altar with a dignity that seemed a miracle or a diabolical illusion. How can one accept one's own ritual murder without panic? The answer lies in a cultural code shared throughout Mesoamerica. A captive from the hostile state of Tlacaelel shared the basics of cosmology with the Aztecs. For him, death on the sacrificial stone was one of two options for a good death, on par with dying in battle. It was the ultimate recognition of his valor by the enemy. Showing fear or begging for mercy was considered the greatest shame, which would devalue the sacrifice and deprive him of a glorious afterlife. He was trapped in a cultural matrix and had to play his part. But it turned out the priests had a way to bypass even the strongest self-preservation instinct through direct chemical influence on the brain. Spanish missionaries wrote with horror about Tenochtitlan, which translates to flesh of the gods. These were psychoactive mushrooms containing psilocybin, but they were not given only to priests for visions. They were purposefully given to victims before their ascent up the pyramid. Under the influence of a powerful psychedelic, a person's reality changed. Terror and doom were replaced by a sense of unity with the universe and a loss of ego. The fear of death physically vanished. This was a perfect biochemical hack of the will. The victim saw their death not as murder, but as a sacred merging with a deity. The ritual became an ecstatic act, and the priest a guide to another world. Modern psychiatry is researching psilocybin to treat the fear of death in terminally ill patients. The Aztecs used it to manufacture consent. But there was a ritual where a person was prepared for such a death for an entire year. The story of the Tlacaelel ritual provides the most terrifying answer to the question of how to make a person desire death. Each year, the most physically perfect young male captive was chosen for this role. For an entire year, he lived as the god Tezcatlipoca on earth. He was worshipped, taught refined manners, and wore luxurious clothes. A month before his death, he was given 4 young women as wives, personifying goddesses. It was a year of absolute luxury, but 5 days before the sacrifice, everything changed. He bid farewell to his wives and voluntarily walked to the pyramid. Before the entire city, he slowly ascended the steps, breaking one of his flutes on each step, a symbol of renouncing earthly pleasures. A year of conditioning transformed a person into a living icon. By the time he reached the summit, he was no longer a person, but a symbol who was obligated to play his role to the end. So here we have a total system. An ideology demanding blood. A policy that uses fear. Psychotechniques that kill compassion. Chemistry that suppresses will. What could go wrong in this seemingly invulnerable structure? It turned mass murder into a sacred duty and death, on the altar, into an honorable spectacle. But it was this perfect system, honed to solve internal problems, that became the cause of its rapid collapse. It was like a complex mechanism designed for sterile conditions, which breaks instantly from a grain of sand from another world. When the Spaniards landed on the shore, they brought with them a new mental operating system, a war of annihilation. Aztec ideology was helpless against the pragmatic cruelty of the conquistadors. All the elements of the system we have studied converged at one moment to create a catastrophe. Why couldn't an army of 200,000 warriors destroy a force of a few hundred Spaniards? On the surface, the answer is obvious: steel, gunpowder, and horses. But the facts tell a different story. The decisive difference was not in the hardware, but in the programming. Decades of flower wars had programmed the Aztecs to capture prisoners, not to kill. They risked their lives to take an enemy alive, while the conquistadors simply killed. This became fatal during the Night of Sorrows, on June 30th, 1520. The Aztecs could have completely annihilated Cortez's retreating force, but instead, they rushed to capture prisoners and trophies. This ritualistic greed gave Cortez time to escape, and he did not return alone. He brought back an army that the Aztecs themselves had created for him. Where did a defeated Cortez get thousands of warriors to besiege Tenochtitlan? He was not a brilliant diplomat. He was a detonator. The main striking force of his new army was the Tlacaelels, the very people the Aztecs had used for decades as a farm for the flower wars. The entire economy of fear, created for suppression, had a monstrous backlash. It created an enemy whose hatred was stronger than fear. The fall of Tenochtitlan was not the victory of 500 Spaniards. It was the culmination of a civil war ignited by the Aztecs themselves. During the final assault, up to 150,000 indigenous warriors fought on Cortez's side. The system of sacrifice had literally armed those who would destroy it. But even with an army, Cortez could have lost if not for one more factor. The Aztec ideology paralyzed the will of their own leader. Why did Moctezuma II, or the emperor, allow the enemy into his capital? He was shackled by myth. An ancient prophecy spoke of the return of a light-skinned, bearded god, Quetzalcoatl, from the east in the year 1 Reed. By a fateful coincidence, Hernán Cortés landed on the coast in 1519, the year 1 Reed. His appearance and the direction of his arrival perfectly matched the prophecy. Moctezuma and his priests, whose world was built on omens, were trapped by their own ideology. This caused cognitive paralysis. Instead of ordering the destruction of the newcomers, Moctezuma sent them gifts, including 2 discs of gold and silver the size of a wagon wheel. The system that demanded thousands of victims to appease the gods left the Aztecs defenseless against a handful of adventurers. An empire built over centuries collapsed in 2 years. The ideology created to save the world became the cause of its destruction. The military doctrine, the politics of terror, and religious fatalism. The 3 pillars of their strength became 3 nails in the coffin of their civilization. Everything that made them strong within Mesoamerica made them fragile in the face of the outside world. This is the main lesson of their history. But although the empire is dead, and its gods are forgotten, the fundamental mechanisms that underpinned it are eternal. The human ability to create ideologies that justify any cruelty in the name of a higher purpose has not disappeared. The story of the Aztecs is not a tale of the past. It is a mirror. And now we will assemble all 7 elements of their death machine to understand what it says about ourselves. Let's put this machine together. First element. Any great ideology requires a resource. The Aztec idea of a cosmic debt worked like a powerful pump, creating a vacuum, and the flower wars were the pipeline that continuously pumped human lives into this vacuum. This is an unbreakable link. Software doesn't work without hardware. Any totalitarian ideology that promises a paradise on Earth or racial purity similarly creates a need for a resource. And when that resource is declared to be people, enemies of the state, infidels, untermenschen, the system inevitably creates its gulags, its concentration camps. The Aztecs simply took this logic to its ritualistic absolute. The conclusion is simple. Always look not at the goal an ideology proclaims, but at the resource it intends to burn to achieve it. Second element. For the conveyor belt to work, a 3-fold psychological conditioning is needed. It worked like a 3-legged stool. The first leg, the dehumanization of the executioner. Asceticism and self-mutilation killed the priest's empathy. The second leg, the sacralization of the process. Architecture, rituals, and living knives turned murder into a sacred act, removing personal guilt. The third leg, breaking the victim's will. Cultural code and psychoactive mushrooms turned a person into a symbol who walk to their death willingly. Remove even one leg and the whole structure collapses. The ritual becomes a disgusting slaughter. If the priest feels sympathy, if the knife is just a knife, if the victim screams in terror, the system breaks. This same principle is used by all military propaganda and genocidal rhetoric. Third element, systems built on fear are always unstable. The economy of fear was effective in the short term. It secured tribute and suppressed rebellions. But in the long term, it worked against the Aztecs by accumulating hatred. The empire was like a bow they constantly drew, terrorizing their neighbors. This created immense tension. But the bowstring eventually snapped, striking the archer himself. Cortez was merely the external force that pierced a hole in this cauldron, but it exploded from within, with the force of hatred built up over decades. It was the Tlacaelels, who had supplied human tribute for decades, who gave Cortez both warriors and knowledge of the Aztec army's weaknesses. We have taken this system apart, piece by piece. We have seen how religion, politics, and psychology intertwined. But behind all the mechanisms are people. People like the architect of the ideology, Tlacaelel. And here is the main unanswered question. What was their primary driving force? A true, fanatical belief that the world would perish without blood? Or a cold political cynicism that used religion as the most effective tool of power? Were they brilliant manipulators or sincere fanatics? Now, a question for you. What do you think it was? True faith or political cynicism? Write just one word in the comments. Faith or cynicism? Let's see which answer gets more votes.